Welcome to Home Ground. I'm Brian Kahn. When we think of paintings of the American West in the 19th century, what names come to mind? Perhaps George Catlin, whose extensive 1830s paintings of Native Americans pioneered the field. Or toward the end of the century, Frederick Remington, or Montana's Charlie Russell. Less well known, perhaps, is the work of John Mix Stanley. During the 1840s and 50s, he painted a broad cross-section of America's native people. And in terms of real-world impact, the case can be made that Stanley's work had by far the greatest impact, by both honoring the traditional native way of life and encouraging the westward expansion that would lead to its destruction. Peter Hassrick, Director Emeritus of Cody's Buffalo Bill Center of the American West, knows a lot about John Mix Stanley and his art. Peter, many thanks for joining us on Home Ground.
Thank you.
Let's start with you. Where'd you grow up? What'd your folks do?
Well, I was fortunate to have been born in Philadelphia and got to leave there at a young age of 10 when we moved west. And my father was an anthropologist interested in the American Indians. We moved to Oklahoma, to a little town of Anadarko, and it was full of Indians, and he ran an Indian museum there for the Department of the Interior. And then we moved to Denver, and he became a curator at the Denver Art Museum, ran the Native Arts Department at the Denver Art Museum for many years, and became assistant director of the Denver Art Museum ultimately. So I grew up in a world that involved museums and involved appreciation of the object, of the integrity of cultural objects. My father was a collector of American antiques, American paintings. He was also an inveterate writer, and so those things were born into my being from a very young age. And then he bought a ranch when he turned 45. And pushed cows. He was a gentleman rancher, Harvard-educated gentleman rancher, 450 cow-calf units.
Your mom?
She was a concert harpsichordist, so I went to sleep each night listening to her practice Scarlatti.
So you were steeped in the West and in art both, clearly.
Right, and so that sort of shaped what I wanted to do. I wanted to stay in the West. I loved the West. I had an appreciation for native peoples, and for ranching, and for sort of cattle culture, and for great museums. The Denver Art Museum, during my stay there, grew and grew to an important national institution that it is today.
How about your education? Where'd you go to high school? Where'd you go to college?
I went to high school in Steamboat Springs, to a prep school. It was sort of a mountain college, a preparatory school, where we did a lot of skiing.
That's a frank admission, and we appreciate candidness on the show. How about college?
That's why I like Montana.
How about college?
And then I went to college there at the University of Colorado, majored in classics and in history, and then went to the University of Denver. Got a graduate degree in museum studies and in art history.
It sounds like you were pretty well set on a path. Am I mistaken? In other words, you knew what you wanted to do when you went to college, or did you learn something in college that changed your direction?
Well, I wanted to teach when I got out of undergraduate work. I taught in a prep school for 5 years, and then I decided I wanted to go into art history and museum work, and so I went back to the University of Denver to help me with that. And I wanted to do something different than most art historian students do, and I wanted to study American art, and I wanted to study the art of the American West. Now, no college in the United States was prepared to teach me that, so staying in the West, working with the curators at the Denver Art Museum, and shaping a career for myself, really. I worked on my thesis on Western artists who explored the West early on, and I came to graduate, and I had a job offer at the greatest museum of Western art in its day in the 1960s, which was the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. And
so you just stepped right into it.
I just stepped right into it. They didn't even want me to finish my degree. They just wanted to get me there because I was academically and intellectually excited about it, and they could see that.
You've had a distinguished career with museums. Can you summarize it for us?
I started at the Inman Carter, went
Right.
there for 5 years, and then got the job in Cody in 1976 as the executive director of what was then called the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, and now is known as the Buffalo Bill Center of the West.
That was 76.
76 to 96, 20 years I ran that operation. Then I went to Santa Fe and was the founding director of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. That lasted a couple of years. I felt like I wanted to do some teaching. I went to the University of Oklahoma, where I became the endowed Charles Russell Professor of Western American Art at the Russell Center at the University of Oklahoma. From the University of Oklahoma, I spent a couple of years in early retirement. I thought I wanted to retire, but I wasn't ready to retire. And I was offered a job as curator of Western art at the Denver Art Museum, which my father had really started back in the 50s, and it had never gone anywhere, and they really wanted to do something with it. And so I went down there and gave 5 years of my career to the Denver Art Museum and made that department the leading department of Western art and culture in America at that time.
You're listening to Home Ground, and I'm Brian Kahn. We are talking with Peter Hassrick, Director Emeritus of Cody's Buffalo Bill Center of the American West, about the art of John Mix Stanley. You spent 2 decades at the Cody. Tell us about what it was and what it is now.
Well, the Cody Museum got started in the teens with what was called the Buffalo Bill Memorial Association, and they used some money that was given to them by the state of Wyoming to attract Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, to give them money in her will to build an art wing on what was built in the 1920s as a Buffalo Bill Museum in a log cabin. And so by 1959, with the help of Dr. Harold McCracken, who was their first director, it became the sort of combined Buffalo Bill Historical Center, the Whitney and the Buffalo Bill Museum. When I got there, it had been augmented and increased in size and had the Buffalo Bill Museum and the Whitney together in one building, and it had quite a remarkable Northern Plains Indian collection, which was then just called the Plains Indian Museum, and that collection was there. And so I saw the potential of this museum. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't have potential under Harold, who ran the operation for 15 years, but it was something that it attracted huge audiences during the summer, but it was an institution that needed to be regarded on the national level as an important cultural entity. And so it was my passion to make it a national institution, and we organized major traveling exhibitions that went across the country. Our first one opened at the Brooklyn Museum and traveled to Pittsburgh and to Oakland, California, and to Denver. And we began to design programs, exhibitions, scholarly publications, and seminars and symposia that attracted national audiences. And so we built that museum to have a national presence by the time I left. Just a little example. When I got there were 300 books in the library. When I left, there were 23,000 volumes in the library over 20 years.
Wow.
So it's quite a scholarly resource as well as a repository for remarkable artifacts and cultural materials, paintings, sculptures, but also Indian artifacts. We built the Plains Indian Museum in '79. We added the Firearms Museum, the Cody Firearms Museum, in '89 or '90. And so during the course of my tenure there, in my 20 years, we more than doubled the size of the physical plant, as well as expanding the program substantially. And today it's grown to be even much more than I had ever dreamed of. It's added the Draper Natural History Museum to it, and the Whitney and the Buffalo Bill wings have been reinstalled. The Indian Museum was recently reinstalled, and it still not only has national stature, but it is an impressive place to visit. Most people come and think they can spend an hour, and they end up spending a day.
It is a
Hundreds of
fabulous-
thousands of people visit it every year, and they're just blown away by it. And I heard it in the hall just 2 days ago. This couple standing there said, "We've been to the Smithsonian, and this place is so much better."
Hard to top that. With that background, where did you cross paths with John Mix Stanley?
When I was doing my master's thesis, I decided I would target the artist explorers who came into the West before 1850. The earliest artists into the West with a government expedition were two artists with Stephen Long's expedition that came up the Platte River and through Colorado and back out the Arkansas River. And so I focused on those artists, Samuel Seymour and Titian Ramsey Peale, but then I began to put together the fact that there were many, many more artists who played a role, and included in that was a chapter on a fellow named John Mix Stanley, who had gone with the military in the 1840s along the Santa Fe Trail to California, and it also played a major role in the Trans-Mississippi Pacific Railroad surveys, Transcontinental Railroad surveys.
All right, so you come across this story. What leads you to dig into it?
Well, Stanley was probably the most remarkable painter of the group. I mean, he was searching. Part of his passion in life was to become a major American figure in on the national scene as a painter. Many of the other artists who traveled at that same time, and you had mentioned earlier George Catlin, for example, who was a remarkable man in many, many ways. He was driven primarily by science, and Stanley, to the contrary, was driven by a passion to be a fine artist. And so he didn't paint as many paintings as Catlin. Catlin often excused this sort of slapdash quality of many of his paintings because of the exigencies of time. I didn't have time to spend more than many hours on this particular portrait. I had to paint the broadest spectrum I could possibly find. Stanley stopped and painted great pictures. And so that's the difference. One motivated by aesthetics and quality fine art, the other motivated by science, recording all the elements of nature so that you could understand the divine order of the universe. That was Catlin's mandate.
How interesting. I didn't know the difference between the two. Do you know the story as to what motivated him to want to become a great artist, Stanley?
I don't know. He started. He didn't write a lot, but he started as a sort of painter of images on coaches, and then he moved to Detroit. And he met a guy named James Bowman, who was a portrait painter who had trained in Philadelphia, moved to Toronto, became a teacher, and then came to Detroit, where Stanley was. And Stanley learned how to paint a likeness. And then he went on the road because he was an inveterate traveler and an explorer. Wanderlust was his middle name. And so he couldn't stop himself. And once he learned how to capture a likeness, he went on the road as an itinerant painter through the Midwest, what's called the Midwest today, but to Galena, Illinois, and then up and down the East Coast in Philadelphia, and New York, and Boston, painting pictures of people.
And how does he end up going west with the Army? That was the 1840s?
He ends up going west for the first time in the early 1840s because something happened. He wanted to find a niche. And that niche was going to be painting native people. But there was this guy named George Catlin who had a gallery of 400 paintings he was trying to sell to the U.S. government. There was a guy named Alfred Jacob Miller who had just been to the West with Captain William Drummond Stewart to Wyoming, the Wind River Range, and he was known as a great Indian painter. There were a number of other painters, but something happened in 1840, and that was that both Catlin and Miller decided to go to Europe. Catlin because he was frustrated that Congress wouldn't buy his collection, and Miller because his patron, Sir William Drummond Stewart, wanted him to come live for a couple of years in his castle and paint big pictures for his castle.
So that is an opportunity for Stanley?
It was absolute. That was his green light, and he headed west. and started painting. He met a fellow in Troy, New York, he was hanging out in Troy, New York. His name was Sumner Dickerman, and they formed a partnership, and Dickerman was kind of the businessman, and Stanley was the painter.
Where does the Army come into this?
Well, Dickerman and Stanley spent a couple of years in Oklahoma, what we call Oklahoma, what was called Indian Territory at that time. Remember the Trail of Tears and the removal of the Indians from the South during the Jackson administration? That's 1830. So 10 years before, they go to Oklahoma. He's able to paint in 1 week. He's able to see the representation of 16 tribes at an international peace treaty, 16 tribes, 2,000 Indians in a 1 week period. He's able to see. He spends 3 weeks there painting as many portraits as he can of these Indians. So the first experience he has in the West was in Oklahoma. So Stanley and Dickerman put together an Indian gallery. It traveled briefly, and they found that it had great reviews but not enough attendance. And so Stanley decides he better go west again and find a new group of Indians to paint. And he heads west on the Santa Fe Trail, ends up in Santa Fe in 1846, the same time as the Mexican War breaks out. And he runs into Stephen Watts Kearny, who has 400 troops to take over the Mexican army, and they go west. They hire Stanley as the official expeditionary military artist to go along and document the trip, and they go from Santa Fe to San Diego in 3 months.
Now then he goes west again in the 1850s, right?
He did. He developed an Indian gallery of 150 paintings. He brought it through the East Coast and dropped it at the Smithsonian Institution. And he, like Catlin, implored the government to buy his collection. 2 times he got turned down, and the second time he decides he better find another way to go out west and find more Indians. And Isaac Stevens, who is the territorial governor of Washington Territory, hires him to take a trip with him, a 6-month trip across northern Montana from St. Paul to Puget Sound.
And the purpose of that trip is?
To survey a route for a transcontinental railroad.
Now, you wrote an article, I thought it was a fascinating article, called John McStanley in Montana Magazine, where you highlight, at least for me, the irony or contradiction. Here's a guy that painted the native people with full respect and artistic integrity and represented it, I'll let you summarize it, in a very positive light, but was in fact working in support of the expansionist imperative or tendencies of the American nation, which would destroy that very culture. Am I misstating it? How would you state it?
Well, he had 2 priorities, and they did provide a paradox. One was to give a face to Native people, a face in the most brilliant way he possibly could do as a creative person. The other was to follow the sort of ideals of manifest destiny and to make a living. And so he represented both sides of that paradox. One, looking at the West as a stage for progress, a stage for development. The second, looking at the West as an untrammeled Eden, as a place of natural beauty that was divinely ordained to stay as it was. And how do you resolve that? That's the great American paradox of the West, is one is a stage of progress and the other is an ideal paradise. And he believed in both of those, and the way he solved it in his mind, and it might not be how you and I would solve it today, but was to idealize both. To idealize the presence of the Western explorer and to idealize the presence of the Indian, not necessarily making the Indian a noble savage, but making the Indian important in our iconography.
One of the things that struck me reading your article was something I really hadn't thought of, the power of art to influence decision makers in fundamental public policy arenas. He showed what was there to people of power through his art. Is that fair? And encouraged them in certain kinds of decisions?
He shaped the image of what he and Stevens wanted people to perceive as the West, how it looked.
How
and
so?
He was trying to support the idea of a Transcontinental Railroad. Stevens, of course, wanted the railroad to go on the northern route. And so they tried to show a landscape that was beautiful and idyllic and that was relatively level but was well wooded so that the trains could have wood and water to run on, and that where there weren't people who, like the Blackfeet, who they were very afraid of, they wanted to be sure that they were presented as a population that had been at least placated, if not were downright friendly to American Anglo interests.
It just struck me in looking at the artwork and your summary of it, how we lose track of the fact that in those times there was no other way to get a visual image of what the West looked like other than art. There were no televisions, there were no cameras. And the power that had to have on the imagination of the people who were viewing his work when they saw it.
Well, in fact, he was both a great draftsman who recorded in his sketches and then later in his paintings that were then turned into lithographs that then were illustrated, the 12 volumes that were presented to Congress of the Transcontinental Surveys. There were 4 different surveys. He was only on one. But he was also, interestingly enough, a great photographer. He took a daguerreotype camera with him on the Stevens expedition.
I didn't realize
all those
that.
daguerreotypes are lost. Never have we found a single one of them. But he was known, and Stevens writes frequently about how good a photographer he is, and he would take 2 images, one for Stevens and one to give to the Indian.
You're listening to Home Ground, and I'm Brian Kahn. We are talking with Peter Hassrick, Director Emeritus of Cody's Buffalo Bill Center of the American West, about the art of John Mix Stanley. So you have a grand opening and exhibition coming up at the Cody of his work, correct?
That's correct. On the 6th of June, the public opening of Painted Journeys, the art of John Mix Stanley, about 60 paintings and drawings that are extant today. And that will be the first major retrospective exhibition that Stanley has ever enjoyed, except for when he had his Indian gallery at the Smithsonian in the 1850s and early 1860s. The irony is, the sad thing is, that the Smithsonian burned in 1865, and with the Smithsonian fire, all his Indian gallery, except for 7 paintings, were lost. And so to find 60 extant paintings today of works that he had copied or works that he had produced that didn't get into the Indian gallery was quite a challenge. But it's a fantastic array of this guy's talents.
You say quite a challenge. Most of us don't know anything about, A, what it takes to put on a normal exhibition, let alone B, pull together something like this. What's the background?
Well, this exhibition started as a book, and we were trying to document all the known artists' work. We found about 230 paintings and drawings by him that are still extant today. And from that, then, that became the core of the publication, a catalog of the known works, plus insights into the artist and his times and his era. And then from that book, we decided this would make it a remarkable exhibition. And the director and curator at the Cody Museum decided that was what they wanted too. And so a couple of years ago, the book, which had been in the works for a year, became an exhibition as well. And it takes about 2 years to negotiate the loans of the paintings. Paintings are coming from the State Department, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, from the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., from all over the country, the Phoenix Art Museum. They're coming to this one place, and then this will show for about 3 months, and then it will travel to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to the Gilcrease Museum, and ultimately to the Tacoma Art Museum in Washington.
So it'll be at the Cody for 3 months, roughly.
Throughout the summer, yes.
Okay. That sounds like an elaborate, complex undertaking that needs great thought in advance. Where did the idea come from? What's the genesis of this?
Well, the spark came from a great American art scholar named Julie Schimmel, who worked on her doctoral dissertation in the 1980s and developed a huge body of scholarship on Stanley. And that material was eventually given over to a commercial gallery, the Gerald Peters Gallery in Santa Fe, and they called and asked me if I would use this material to delve into and research this project and write a book.
When did they talk to you?
About 4 years ago. But the scholarship had gone on before me, so I was given all of Dr. Schimmel's papers to work with, and then I added and morphed them and came out with the finished product that became the book and used other authors. But the Cody Museum saw the potential of this as a major exhibition and a major contribution to American art history scholarship.
And the title of the book?
The title is Painted Journeys, The Art of John Stanley.
So is it fair to say the book is in effect a catalog for the exhibition?
It is at this point, yes.
Something like this costs a lot of money. It has to have institutional and personal passion behind it. How is this financed? The book, the exhibition? Tell us about that.
Well, they're packaged together and then sold. For example, the National Endowment for the Arts has given a very substantial contribution to this project. And the two other museums that are taking the exhibition, they pay a fee that helps to pay for the insurance and the crating and the couriers that have to fly with the paintings back and forth from their various institutions. It's a very complex kind of a process. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to complete. I mean, this project probably is short of $1 million. It takes real ability to raise money as well as to convince people. But much of the funding for this exhibition has come from private donors who I can't mention on the air, but they are mentioned in the frontispiece of the catalog and will be credited in the exhibition as well, as will Julie Schimmel, who is the sort of intellectual inspiration for this exhibition.
Let's go back to him. You described him as a man of ambition to be a great artist and nationally recognized. The terrible frustrations that he encountered with the Congress turning down his request that they acquire the artwork, correct?
Correct.
Then the burning of his artwork, which must have been a terrible blow. Was he still alive when the artwork burned?
No. That happened in 1965, and 1872 is when he died. And people often ask, what did he die of? And I say, a broken heart.
Tell me then what this exhibition represents to you as a guy that knew him in terms of his life goals.
I hope it represents to everyone the fact that artists hope that their work, their life work, will provide them with some sort of legacy. And his legacy was frustrated, as we just mentioned. And this exhibition and this publication, called a retrospective exhibition and a catalog of his known works, those things, those objects will be the physical, corporeal representation of his legacy, and that these years later, finally, it is coming to fruition that he's being given a place on the pedestal of American art.
Peter Hassrick, I very much regret to say we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for being with us on Home Ground. And to our listeners, many thanks for being with us. We hope you'll join us next week. Home Ground is an independent production of Artemis Common Ground and does not necessarily reflect the views of this radio station. Post-production by Valtron Recording Studios. We welcome your ideas for new programs at www.homegroundradio.org. Home Ground is made possible by grants from the Liz Claiborne Art Ortenberg Foundation, Cinnabar Foundation, Humanities Montana, and the Greater Montana Foundation, encouraging communication about issues, trends, and values of importance to Montanans.